Good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, 4 Palestine Action activists apply to have the judge in their case removed. Is the war in Ukraine winding down? And if so, why? And the Makerfield by-election is just around the corner. So Question Time did a special with the candidates with one notable absence. I'm Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by the big man himself, the boss, Aaron Bastani.
The
How
boss.
are you?
I like it. I like it, Stephen. Although I should say this is very much, I think it shows the strength and depth of the Novara squad. That, we haven't got Alex or Gary.
That's true.
We don't normally host together.
Yeah.
This is growing as an organization, which is very reassuring.
We've got a deep bench, to
deep
use a
bench.
sports metaphor. And on the subject of sports, before we get into tonight's show, you might be wondering what exactly we're wearing. Well, that would be the brand new limit run of Novara Media FC shirts. Very limited, as we've already sold over a third of the stock. They're made by Rage Sport, an anti-fascist sports kit manufacturer in Italy that pays its workers properly and uses all recycled materials. We've got 2 colors. I'm wearing away. Aaron is wearing home. And you guys have been loving them so far. So look, get your hands on one. And you're really going to have to shift it. Get your hands on one before they sell out. To do that, just head to shop.novaramedia.com. Now, Aaron, you're usually in your box logo tee. Why should everyone watching tonight grab a football shirt?
Well, firstly, there's not many of these left. I think we probably will sell out of these today. The link's in the description below. Today. I actually prefer that one, personally, but it's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously Palestine colours, right, as well.
It's gorgeous, yeah. It's a gorgeous shirt. It's really nicely done. They're both very nicely done. This is a very ethical shirt. The inks are ethical. The supply chains are great. The producer is Italy. Somebody was joking on my Instagram earlier saying, mine says made in China. You couldn't have yours yet because it couldn't have arrived. It was somebody winding people up. They're made in Italy.
Trolls.
Yeah, trolls, right. By workers earning a good wage, enjoying good standards and conditions. Same with the T-shirt, the Novara box T-shirt. Organic cotton, great supply chains, unionized labor with regards to printing. That's Novara's business as usual. But 70% of what you're paying still goes to support our journalism. So you get a great top, the most ethical supply chain you're going to find, and you're supporting our work here at Novara.
I actually think I prefer the black and white. I've got one of these at home already, but I'm going to get one of those, I think. It's sort of chic, isn't it?
The grass is always greener. Yeah, black is always a good one for black and gold is always a good one for football.
All right, let's get on with the show. On Friday, the 12th of June, 4 Palestine Action activists will be sentenced for criminal damage, with a judge in the case considering whether to sentence them as terrorists. But now those defendants have applied to have the judge removed over allegations of bias. That's according to a new report from Novara's Harriet Williamson. That was just out today. This case may be one of the most politicized in recent British history, with reporting restrictions, court orders withholding information from juries, and even a public intervention by the then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper having raised questions around the justice of the process. Last month, Leona Ellie Cameo, Charlotte Lottie Head, Fatima Zainab Rajwani, and Sam Corner were convicted of criminal damage following a retrial. In an earlier trial, the jury had returned no verdict on those charges. Sam Corner was additionally convicted of grievous bodily harm, though without intent, which was the charge that had been brought, a charge that an earlier jury had also returned no verdict on. At that same second trial, fellow activists Zoe Rogers and Jordan Devlin were acquitted. Following those convictions, the judge, Mr. Justice Jeremy Johnson, lifted reporting restrictions on the trial, meaning it could finally be revealed that all 6 defendants had been labelled with a so-called terror connection in this case. That means that, at sentencing, Justice Johnson could subject them to longer sentences, delayed parole, and potentially decades of having to report to counter-terror authorities after their release. Now, if the judge finds a terror connection, it will be the first time in British legal history that a defendant could be sentenced as a terrorist for criminal damage, for damaging property, without ever facing a terrorist charge. In fact, it would also be only the second time anyone's ever been sentenced as a terrorist without facing a terror charge. This is from Harriet's article. The only previous case where a defendant was sentenced as a terrorist without a terrorist conviction was the Parsons Green bomber, who was found guilty of attempted murder after planting a homemade bomb on a London tube. Attempted murder versus criminal damage, breaking things, breaking drones, breaking the door to a factory, breaking, alarm boxes, computers containing software, perhaps being used to update drones and other kind of technological killing machines in Gaza. Now, the relevant law here is the Counterterrorism and Sentencing Act of 2021, which extended the list of those crimes that could be considered terror crimes. Before then, it was only the most severe crimes involving, actual or attempted violence, death, kidnapping, that kind of thing that qualified. After 2021, that was extended to any ordinary criminal offense that carried more than a 2-year sentence, including criminal damage. The 4 convicted activists were also prevented from airing defences to the jury that involved explaining to them why they had broken the Albert Development Lab in Filton, which was to destroy weapons and software intended to be used in Israel's genocide in Gaza. Nor were they allowed to remind the jury that they had the legal power to acquit them on grounds of conscience. And when one of their defense barristers hinted at that, the judge tried to prosecute him too. This is from the article. The defence's bid to remove Justice Johnson is in part due to his unprecedented attempt to have the lead defense barrister, Rajiv Menon KC, prosecuted for contempt of court, a move described as troubling by the Bar Council. Menon, who won his appeal against contempt proceedings, was alleged to have breached the judge's direction that lawyers were not permitted in their closing speeches to invite the jury to acquit on the basis of conscience, a principle known as jury equity. Justice Johnson could still refer Menon to the Attorney General to decide whether to initiate contempt proceedings. Campaign group Defend Our Juries have submitted a formal complaint to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office today, one signed by over 5,000 people, including lawyers, law professors, retired police officers, and magistrates. They say that decisions by the judge amount to, quote, a pattern of exceptional, biased, and discriminatory conduct. Harriet's article gives some examples of that conduct, saying this. This includes his decision to treat the defendant's desire to prevent Israel killing Palestinian civilians as an aggravating rather than mitigating feature. According to the judge, the intention to prevent the deaths of Palestinian civilians is what brings their actions within the scope of the Terrorism Act, as he considered it an attempt to influence the Israeli government. The complaint also alleges that Justice Johnson acted vindictively in remanding Head, Cameo, and Redjwana to custody after their retrial. They had already spent 18 months in prison before their first trial and only 10 months on bail after the first jury declined to convict them. Denying 3 young women the opportunity to prepare themselves and their families for a further period in prison was cruel and vindictive and not backed by the prosecution, the complaint reads. A spokesperson for Defend Our Juries said this. Given the widespread concerns that have been raised, Justice Johnson should remove himself from these proceedings. The use of secret terror sentencing for the first time in British history against protesters who sought to save lives by disrupting the supply of weapons to Israel demonstrates the dangerous consequences of Palestine Action's prescription. Sentencing the Filton 4 as terrorists, despite their conviction for an ordinary criminal offence, would establish an extraordinary and deeply authoritarian precedent, allowing countless more protesters to be tried for an ordinary offence, but secretly sentenced as terrorists without juries knowing this when they convict. On Friday, the 12th of June, protesters will gather outside the court, with some holding up signs reading, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." That is, of course, illegal under the Terrorism Act, following the prescription of Palestine Action by Yvette Cooper last summer. And even though Palestine Action founder Huda Amori defeated the government in an unprecedented judicial review earlier this year, with the panel of judges finding that Yvette Cooper had acted unlawfully in banning the group, it remains an offence to publicly express support for it while a government appeal is pending. And in what some might think is rather remarkable timing, the result of that appeal will be handed down on Monday, the 15th of June, just a few days after the sentencing of the Filton activists. Earlier today, I was joined by David White, Professor of Law at Queen Mary University and Director of the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice. He is one of the 5,000 signatories of the Defend Our Juries complaint, and he handed it in to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office today. I began by asking him why he'd added his name to that complaint.
Well, we've been monitoring those cases quite closely, and by those cases I mean all of the protest cases involving climate protesters and also Palestine Solidarity protesters. We've been monitoring them at the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice in Queen Mary University of London. And we produced a report that Novara reported on last week, I think, which have some quite alarming trends. And this particular case involving Mr. Justice Johnson, we think is a kind of exemplar of the kind of concerns that we are seeing as coming up fairly regularly. But this case is quite an extreme one, and I mean, it's not just us who've been involved in this. There's 5,000 people who have signed the same letter, which are expressing concerns about bias and discriminatory conduct on the part of this particular judge. There are three reasons for that. There are three reasons for us saying that we have those concerns. The first is that which is a kind of complex one, but he's treated the conscientious motivation of the defendants. So the idea that they were engaging, and we know what this case was. It was a case in August 2024, where a number of people went into a factory owned by Elbit Systems in Bristol to prevent drones, or to make sure that the drones that were being used to kill Palestinian civilians were disarmed and disabled. So the first point is that the judge treated that motivation as an aggravating factor. Now, we have to be very clear about what that means. That means he sees that as a factor, and in this particular case, the aggravation is that there is a terrorism connection. So, and the reasoning is quite complex. What the judge said was that they were trying to damage property to be made available to the Israeli government, which is clearly the case, and thereby influence the Israeli government. And that's the point that makes it definable as terrorism. So he's used a conscientious commitment to preventing a genocide as the aggravating factor, which may mean that these people will get several years in prison when they've already served long sentences in remand, and we'll maybe come on to that. So that's the first point. The second objection is that he acted unlawfully in referring the lead barrister Rajiv Menon for contempt of court. You may know about this case, or those who are watching this may know about this case, because it was referred to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal ruled that this was unlawful. Simply for what Rajiv Menon had said in his summation, in his closing remarks in the case. Now, one of the things that's most concerning, first of all, the legal profession is if not, well, let's not say unanimous, but has in a very widespread sense, condemned what happened there, and in fact, the chair of the Bar Council welcomed the Court of Appeal case, which ruled that it was unlawful that it had been passed to the High Court, that he was prosecuted for contempt of court. But that has a chilling effect on the legal profession. It means that particularly young lawyers are not, going to be much less likely to want to represent the kind of clients that Rajiv Menon was representing if they're going to face those kind of charges. And it also meant actually that 5 of the defendants in that case had to sack, against their will, their defence counsel, because that was the only way in which they could table some of the arguments in the court. Thirdly, he acted vindictively and without support from the prosecution when he remanded 3 of the defendants. Now these are 3 young people, and I want to kind of stress how incredible an experience they've gone through, incredibly difficult an experience they've gone through, incredibly traumatic experience they've gone through. They've already been on remand for 80 weeks. In fact, I think it's a little bit more. It's now 83 or 84 weeks they've been held on remand. Now, the normal statutory limit for a period on remand is 6 months, so 26 weeks. And that kind of tells you the level of kind of stress that they've been under without having been convicted of anything. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. All of them very young people. Now, the prosecution has not asked for them to be remanded in custody after the second trial, which is the trial that they'll be sentenced for next week. The prosecution didn't even ask. They didn't think there'd be a risk of absconding. And the judge still remanded them in custody. So there's clearly some level of cruelty and vindictiveness going on there that we want at least investigated. That's the third point. So if we take these points together, I mean, I think what we need to say is that they amount to a pattern of exceptional bias and discriminatory conduct on the part of the judge that has to go to the JCIO, to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office.
I think just something I think worth pointing out as well is that, after that first trial and before this retrial, all of the other charges of aggravated burglary and violent disorder were dropped not only against the 6 defendants in this case, but in fact against all of the 24 Filton defendants, or I believe it's 25 now.
Yeah.
So you were really just looking for all except for one, Sam Corner, who been convicted of grievous bodily harm, although not with intent as it was charged. You're really looking at the pursuit of this one charge with the terror connection. Can I just ask you about the terror connection? I mean, I think one of the things that people find really shocking about this is that the jury wasn't allowed to know about it, and journalists weren't allowed to report about this existing. And it comes in, it's applicable to this level of crime, criminal damage, because of the Counterterrorism and Sentencing Act of 2021, right, which extended it from the kinds of crimes we associated with terror, murder, kidnapping, explosives, and whatever, to anything with a 2-year sentence, a minimum 2-year sentence. And I want to just read you this exchange from Hansard on the debate at the time. This is from Lord Marks. A defendant might be convicted by a jury of the basic offence for which the appropriate penalty might be a short term of imprisonment, but sentenced on the basis of a decision taken by a judge alone, without hearing any evidence that the offence had a terrorist connection and merited a sentence of a long term of imprisonment. I said then, and repeat now, that feature would cut across the principle of our criminal law, that no one should be convicted of an offence except upon admissible evidence, open to challenge in a trial, and, if in the Crown Court, heard by a jury. So, it was as long ago as 2021 that the legal professionals, Lord Marks as a barrister, were bringing up this idea of, there's some kind of infringement on our conception of justice in this country when the jury is asked to sentence on a crime without knowing that actually the consequences of that sentencing will be potentially much worse than they imagined. What do you make of that? Does that? Because the question is, it's not that they're being charged with a terrorism or convicted of a terrorism charge. It's that rather there's something that's happening at the sentencing which is different from the conviction. Does that kind of fine detail make a difference to the principle of justice, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I would want to know, first of all, why that was withheld from the jury, because it's quite astounding, actually, given what you've said. And the quote you've just read out, clearly that was 5 years ago, but it was quite prophetic. This is really what's happening. The chickens are coming home to roost in this case. So the first question we have to ask is why that was the case. Now, that's not particularly a part of our complaint, because I'm fairly sure that will go to the Court of Appeal. I'm sure that will feature in any appeal. But I also want to say that if I was a member of that jury, I mean, again, this is not particularly a legal issue. This is more a kind of political and moral issue. If I was a member of that jury and I found that out after the case, I mean, I would be absolutely astounded. I would be astounded that I'd been asked to make a decision that potentially could send someone to jail for 10 years. I mean, hopefully it won't be anything like that. And I also hope that there's a motion going to the Old Bailey on Monday asking the judge to recuse himself from this case because of the bias and discriminatory issues that we've raised. And I would hope the judge takes a long look at himself and considers that. But it's let's be honest, it's probably not likely. It may well be the sentences are going to be harsh. And if I was a juror, I would be absolutely livid that I'd found someone guilty for the offences you've just noted, and that they may go to jail for years and years more than they've already served. It's absolutely astounding. I mean, it really is when you add up the numbers. And I think, and I mean by add up the numbers of the potential time that people might serve on top of what they've served already. I mean, the other thing we shouldn't lose sight of when we talk about this technical detail is that the way that the word terrorism has been bandied around. And look, this is not the first time this has happened, right? Terrorism and anti-terrorist laws have been used deliberately to kind of catch all, and by catch all I mean very often catch very large numbers of people in the same ethnic group or the same political group into and label people, and of course the level of miscarriages of justice that we've seen when terrorism charges have been used in the past is very clear, and also the ramping up of punitive sentences and prison sentences generally before we even get to their application in Palestine Action. And I'm thinking about the kind of the moral panics around Muslim terrorists post 9/11. I'm also thinking further back to the way in which terrorism legislation was used in Ireland and in the conflict there. But having said that, one of the things we have to remind ourselves is that old ladies are now being dragged away for holding signs under terrorism legislation, and so we're getting to a point where the way in which terrorism law is being used is becoming, again, I would say, routine, and maybe for another reason, and that's something we have to not just be wary about, because you can't seriously tell me that anybody, that any kind of serious thinking person thinks that we should be dragging off old ladies holding signs and calling them terrorists. But this has very serious consequences in the case that's going to be sentenced next week.
Yeah, on that point that you made about the jury, I mean, not only do I think a current jury member might be furious to learn what happened in their case, but also people asked to serve on a jury in future might be very concerned about whether they are in fact hearing the case they believe that they're hearing, or whether there's a sort of shadow case going on behind the criminal case that they're hearing.
The jury trial is at the very center of all this, and coming back to some of the data that we have on climate cases and on the other Palestine solidarity cases that I mentioned before, the jury has become a battleground, and the prevention of information. So on one hand, the defences that people are allowed to present to the jury, and also basic facts that they're allowed to state to the jury about the things they've damaged and what those things mean to them. For example, that major battleground has been really intensively about restricting the ability of juries to come to a decision, and there's good reason for that, because juries very often, when they hear cases of protest, will not go in the same direction as judges. They will refuse to be as punitive as judges in this case and so many other cases have been. And so I think there's a bigger political issue, of course, that I know you're aware of, and it's been discussed a lot in Novara, but the jury trial. I mean, that's the real kind of the thing that's hanging, the shadow that's hanging over us here. And the reason that they want to double the length of time, of potential sentencing time before you get a jury trial, is precisely because they want to take so many jury trials out of the system, because juries take sensible decisions very often, not always, but very often juries take sensible decisions which reflect a more public spirit, rather than we would see if judges were able to take those decisions without the scrutiny of the jury.
I think some in our audience are going to find the timing of all of this quite curious. The history as well. So you have the Filton defendants arrested, the first of them in 2024, under counter-terror law by counter-terror police. They're then charged with normal criminal charges, but this terror connection is laid against them. What then follows is that Home Secretary Yvette Cooper attempts to succeeds in prescribing Palestine Action as a terror group, sort of on the basis of the fact that these defendants, for the first time in British history, have been found, being applied, having this terror connection applied to them for criminal damage. So Yvette Cooper manages to sort of temporarily succeed in prescribing Palestine Action, even though it will be later ruled unlawful. What do you make of the way in which these two cases have sort of intersected? Does it seem political to you? Does it seem sort of strangely coordinated?
Well, it's not coming from one source, that's for sure, and it's not. I think we have to be a bit careful to it's very easy for us to kind of fall back and thinking about the lobby or about particular powerful interests who are lobbying for this. There may well be them. I'm not sure if there are on the jury per se, but certainly there is a general political mood that is punitive. There's an authoritarian populist mood, to coin a phrase that was used by sociologist Stuart Hall. There is a general direction in which politics is becoming more authoritarian, connected to an imagined kind of populism. It's very easy for a Labour government to respond to some of the right-wing forces that are now emerging in politics, to say, well, we're as authoritarian as you. And so I think it's part of that. I also think it's part of a crisis in the criminal justice system where they cannot deal with the number of cases that they're expected to rising numbers of cases. This is a general issue, actually, a general issue about the punitive nature of the state right now. The state is getting more punitive. Sentences for many things are getting longer. So there is a capacity crisis, if you like, in the criminal justice system. But actually, getting rid of jury trials is not going to save that much money. It's not going to help them out in that way. So I think it's much more about a general political direction towards a kind of authoritarian populism, which also has a softer side, which is that quite often government ministers don't really care about the jury trial, because actually it's one of those technical things that I think when you point it out to the public, they are quite angry about it. But I'm not sure many people are voting on it right now. But I do think that there are many flaws with the criminal justice system. I'm not going to stand here and kind of defend the criminal justice system as it is, but the jury is one of the most important dimensions of that, because it is one of the few checks in the system, and by that I mean checks against judicial power and checks against political power.
I was actually at some of the closing arguments of the Filton Six in the last trial, the trial with the convictions, and at least one of them was drawing the jury's attention to the fact that they might be the last jury that gets to try a case like this. I've got one last question for you, and it's a speculative one. The sentencing for the Filton Four who have been convicted will happen on next Friday, the 12th. Monday the 15th is when the appeals court reads out its decision on the government's appeal against the judicial review that found that Yvette Cooper, the then Home Secretary, had acted unlawfully in prescribing Palestine Action. Many in our audience might find this peculiar timing. Many have said that the way in which the intersection of these cases has operated, where the Palestine Action activists are arrested by terror police at the Filton, at the Elbit site, the terror connection is then made. That then becomes a reason to do the prescription under terror law. Now, perhaps this terror connection, if it's found by the judge and the sentences are applied, using it, then that then also may have an effect on that appeal. What do you think of that kind of chain of, what do you think of that chain of sort of reasoning about the relationship between these cases, this coming week? And what do you think about rather the other kind of a case, which is that there's some very close interconnection between, terrorism definitions, terrorism bans, and terror connection sentencing here?
Look, there's absolutely no doubt about it. There is a concerted effort on the part of the British government, and generally not just the government, but other other parts of the state, other branches of the state, and there's a general mood to clamp down on protest generally. Specifically, I think it's intensified in relation to Palestine, probably because the British government doesn't want that as a thorn in their side, that wants to conduct its own foreign policy and uninterrupted. It doesn't want to be interrupted by people protesting about that, and it doesn't, even when it's supporting an arms industry which is effectively genocidal, when it's exporting genocidal weapons, it doesn't want that interrupted. And it's clear that there is a bit of a crisis, because when the state responds like that, it's also because it feels that it's under threat. Now, whether there's a planned chain of events there, I would say probably not. but there may well be, and there's definitely connections between them too. The two incidents, the two cases that you're talking about, and the ramifications of those. But that's about politics. That's about the way in which, and I think this is also important. We haven't talked about this, but what's incredible about the way judges have responded here is they've responded in a very political way. And I'm going to come back to our report, Britain's Political Prisoners, that we published a couple of weeks ago, because we found, first of all, we found that there were a total of 286 cases of people who'd gone to jail. But the average sentence is 28 weeks for civil disobedience, largely peaceful protest, taking direct action, yeah, but more than six. And some of the sentences for some of the offences, some people are getting a year for breach of the peace. People are getting 4 years for conspiracy. So, and this is over the last 5 years. So this is. It feels like things are coming to a head right now, but this is part of an ongoing pattern where I think the judiciary have been politicised to a level that we've not seen for a long time. I'm not going to say we've not seen before. Of course, we have actually. And the kind of things that we're talking about in relation to the way in which the jury trial is being treated. I would say that's effectively a diplock court. The diplock courts that existed in Ireland, where trials could be huge numbers of trials could take place without juries. That's kind of effectively what we're having here. But in this case, this is not unique to the cases we're going to see next week. So why am I saying all this? Well, I think it's important to recognise that they won't be decisive. They will be decisive, unfortunately, for the people who will be sentenced next week. And I have to say, my heart goes out to them, because these are people who are just trying to prevent children being killed in a genocide, and they're facing years in prison. And so I think we have to focus and think about those, and those people have to be in our thoughts. I find it astounding that this is happening, but it won't be the end, and neither will the prescription case be the end, because if the government loses the prescription case, then it may well take it to the next stage, right? And there will be an appeal, even if of the Filton defendants, even when there is even if the sentences are particularly harsh. So I would also say that there are going to be hundreds of people outside that court next week, and not just in London. I live in Liverpool. There's going to be a lot of people outside the court at the same time in Liverpool, and I think around the country. And that movement's not going away. The one of the things that's been really important about the kind of repressive clampdown we've been discussing is that the climate movement and the Palestine solidarity movement, in many respects, has come together and supported each other, and has turned up in big numbers and has mobilized resources on a level that's hugely impressive, and that's going to continue regardless of what happens next week. I know that's not the question you asked me, Stephen, but I think the issue is that this is an ongoing issue, right? And these things may well be connected, and maybe well be part of a plan. I suspect it's more just part of a political kind of generalized political onslaught, but there's also a generalized political resistance as well that we know is not going away.
That was David White, Professor of Law at Queen Mary University London and Director of the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice, speaking with me earlier today. Now, David made reference to the report he co-authored and released last week called Britain's Political Prisoners. It tracks the pretty horrifying rise in the number of political prisoners being created by the British state in the UK today. You can find a link in the description below. We also covered that report as part of another story last week, this one involving a new documentary about the Filton cases. That's available on our YouTube channel now. Not the documentary, the bit that we covered of it last week. It's been a while since we reported on the war in Ukraine, which has now dragged on for over 4 years. But today it appears there may be some progress towards an end. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenski has written a letter to Russian President Vladimir Putin. In it, he says this. To the President of the Russian Federation, we often hear that you are comfortable with this war. Of course, not in those cases when it comes to the security of your residence in Valdai or your parade in Moscow. Your own life is valuable to you. But now we can all see that Russians are finally becoming less comfortable with this reality, with the fact that the war is bringing more and more negative consequences to Russia. They do not like our drones and missiles. They do not like gasoline shortages and constantly rising prices. We in Ukraine do not want a permanent war. We know very well that life without war is infinitely better, and we want to achieve that. We see that the United States is fully focused on the issue of Iran, and it would be wrong to simply wait until the war in Europe returns to the center of its attention. I am proposing a meeting. Now, Zelensky is right about at least one thing there. Talks between Russia and Ukraine have been stalled for months as US-led negotiations remain frozen because of the Iran war. Indeed, their negotiations about the Iran war remain pretty frozen too. And previous rounds of negotiation between the two sides in Istanbul, Abu Dhabi, and Geneva failed to yield a breakthrough on the key issue of territory in a post-war settlement. The war has also been deprioritized by the US for another reason. It's no longer costing them very much. For most of the last 4 years, it's been American support, not European, that has underwritten the Ukrainian war effort. US military hardware, US loans, US intelligence. The Europeans have been involved too, of course, though not nearly to the same extent. That, however, has now completely changed. All financial aid to Ukraine is now coming from Europe. And with the recent announcement of a 2-year 90 million euro loan, that aid is increasing substantially. The first disbursements from that loan will be this month, with the intention being to keep Ukraine in the fight. Of course, the war is very far from a bed of roses for Kyiv, nor can one say they are winning, whatever wish casting you might hear from the media. But a combination of European money, US intelligence, and Ukraine's burgeoning domestic drone industry means costs are being inflicted on Russian forces too. Putin was forced to admit as much at his annual investment showcase, the Russian Davos, in St. Petersburg. Hours before he addressed the media, Ukrainian drones skirted the Russian air defenses and hit oil and military targets a mere 10 miles from where the forum is being hosted, forcing the Russian leader to admit, to our regret, some of them break through. That led Zelensky to goad the Russian leader in his letter a little bit more. He said this: "Now the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians view it positively that our long-range drones paid a visit to the opening of your forum in St. Petersburg, covering a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers. As you know very well, that distance is not the limit of our capabilities." A reminder, the Russian Federation has 4.5 times the population, 28 times the landmass, and an economy 12 times bigger than that of Ukraine. So why is Europe giving so much money to Ukraine now? And why is the duration of the loan 2 years? After all, this war has gone on for more than 4 years, and it may be, perhaps could possibly extend another 4. Well, it's because the governments of Western Europe, particularly Britain, France, and Germany, aren't only dealing with a truculent, often unhelpful administration in Washington, but also suffering from domestic uncertainty at home. So in the case of Germany, for example, the AfD, who are repeatedly polling first for national elections, are viewed as one of the most sympathetic parties to Moscow in Europe. They have consistently opposed military aid to Ukraine, opposed sanctions on Russia, and have called for a different relationship with Moscow. If the AfD were to govern Germany alone, which at this point still seems unlikely, it's also, I think, unconstitutional, we would likely see a major reduction or end to German weapons deliveries to Ukraine, pressure to ease sanctions on Russia, and resistance to new EU-wide funding packages. In the case of the French Rassemblement National, the story is somewhat different. They have been more critical of Moscow since 2022, despite being historically close to Putin's Russia. But there's still little doubt they would be more skeptical about military and financial support if they won the presidency next year. And it's a similar story with reform here in the UK. The party's leader, Nigel Farage, isn't going on Russia today anymore, but he's certainly not been as vocal in supporting Ukraine as either Labour or the Tories. Of course, there's an election for the French presidency next year, with the polls having the National Rally's Jordan Bardella as a clear front runner and socialist Jean-Luc Mélenchon as his most likely rival. While the AfD are more of a spanner in the works, Germany won't have elections until 2029. In any case, it's quite plausible that by 2029, the radical right could govern in Berlin, in Paris, and in London too. And if the Ukraine war is still going on by then, you can be pretty certain the money will dry up. So for the European allies supporting Ukraine, it's a race against time, with Trump, Putin, and indeed much of their respective electorates an issue. And it may be that Ukraine sees the writing on the wall too. Earlier this week, Zelensky's chief of staff said that getting a deal to end the war before winter this year was the correct and realistic path for Ukraine. This is the president's instruction, said Kirill Burnham, to try to end the war as soon as possible. Aaron, there's some change in tone there from Ukraine, and and as we point out in the piece, Western Europe has flatlining living standards and growth. Is having to deal, as I just mentioned there, with historic growth in the populist right. Can France, Britain, and Germany afford to do this, to finance a war against a top-tier geopolitical power like Russia?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was quite funny seeing Zelenski saying that Russians don't like seeing energy price hikes and, it costs more to fill up your car and all the things that Europeans have been subject to since 2022. Ultimately, Ukraine is much stronger now than I think anyone would have predicted. It has a domestic drone industry, as you said, very, very capable. I think it's the biggest drone manufacturer now in Europe. But on the other hand, it's losing people at an extraordinary rate. I think there are about 300,000 men who haven't really been accounted for, who've basically gone MIA, who should be serving in the military if they're called upon. So it's looking bad for both sides. But ultimately, Russia, as you say, has a much larger population. It has a much greater ability to continue to endure as a domestic economy without any engagement with the West, with America or with Europe. Of course, it would like that. It would like to sell its energy to these places, but it can exist without them. And actually, military Keynesianism and a war economy has suited Russia, broadly speaking, over the last 2 years. Pretty hard in 2022. Since then, it's done pretty well. That seems to be now coming to the end of the road, although we'll see. And there are problems with regards to the Russian economy overheating, labor shortages and whatnot. But I think fundamentally, this is do or die for Ukraine. And people don't really talk about this nearly enough. Ukraine's population was already in collapse before this war. The population pyramid was already terrible. The total fertility rate was already terrible. Many men of military age have now died, obviously, in this war, or they've been casualties of war and their lives have changed forever. Many more have left and will never go back. The fertility rate has fallen even further still. So the long-term consequences of this war for Ukraine are existential. And I think there probably is a segment of Ukrainian nationalist sentiment saying, let's get some kind of deal, let's lick our wounds, and let's try to build what we can of an enduring state infrastructure from a national defense industrial complex to getting people back to, rebuilding something resembling a national economy. But the really important thing in all of this is the timeline. Fundamentally, I think if any one of those three parties comes to power, and I think the most likely is, of course, Bardella being the French president next year, I think that's basically the starting gun on the end of this conflict in terms of European support. So I think it's got 18 months, but for reasons that go beyond Russia and Ukraine, fundamentally it's about France, Germany, and the UK.
I mean, it's an interesting question about how Europe is going to deal with this idea of ending the war soon, because so many European politicians in France, in Germany, here, have sort of linked their own geopolitical strategy to Ukraine winning it, right? They've decided they want to boost defense industries. They see Russia, they see the invasion of Ukraine as a kind of existential European threat, not just a threat to Ukraine, or at least that's how it's been pitched to populations. So, is Zelensky perhaps in saying we want an immediate an end to this war as quickly as possible, and they were talking about by the beginning of winter, is that perhaps putting European leaders in a difficult position when at exactly the moment that they're facing these, as you say, the rise of right-wing populist parties in their countries? Because it makes them look kind of foolish then, doesn't it?
It does make them look foolish. I mean, there are great historical precedents for this. Winston Churchill was the arch-Bolshevik in the 1920s. He was the British architect of trying to get rid of the revolutionary government in St. Petersburg and Moscow. He was at the forefront of that charge by the Whites, the counter-revolutionaries, and you had involvement from basically every great power in Europe at the time, trying to get rid of Lenin and this new regime in Moscow. That failed, and you fast forward 20 years, and Stalin and Winston Churchill are comrades in arms. There's incredible propaganda from the time, on both sides, by the way. You have people like Stalin saying that FDR and Churchill are fellow Democrats. And actually, the struggle is not between capitalism and communism, imperialism and anti-imperialism, but between fascists and Democrats. So people can turn these things on a sixpence. I think, though, the world is somewhat different in so much as obviously we've all got access to the political and historical archive now with social media. And I think that there's a huge incentive for parties on the populist nationalist right to call out that hypocrisy, which wasn't really there in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. I think a smart politician might be able to do it. But fundamentally, you're right. Equally, though, I suppose an easy answer is that the throughput of establishment politicians in Europe is now so fast that nobody has to apologise for the mistakes they make.
That's so true.
Boris Johnson has obviously played a central role in Britain's involvement in Ukraine. You know, he left the scene years ago. So Macron, Johnson, the former SDP Chancellor, Scholz, they're all gone anyway. Merz has really gone all in on Ukraine. He's already hated in Germany. So I suppose he might be somebody who has egg on his face. But of course, like I say, that job of Chancellor isn't up till 2029. In France, I think it's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And the really interesting thing with France is that even if Mélenchon wins, who's the front runner from the left, right now he's polling second, but he's much behind Bardella. But of course, you have a fragmented vote on the left. Big question if he can get those people. But Mélenchon, if he is the candidate from the left, is probably as skeptical about Ukraine and funding this war as Bardella is. So whichever way you look, it's very, very hard to see how this carries on after the French election.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking of an example that really backs up your, this argument about the right-wing populist parties, because one of the reasons that Ukraine is actually getting access to this money now is because one right-wing populist has been replaced by in Hungary, right?
Yeah.
Orbán is gone, Magyar is in. Magyar has stopped blocking the money, which is allowing it to move through, but there are more on the way who are going to block it in exactly the same way as Orbán did. I guess that's the structure of the argument, basically.
Yeah. It's a really interesting one that we might see sort of centrist liberal, well, they're not really that by Western European standards, but centrist liberal politicians in charge of Hungary and Poland, and actually you're going to see the reactionary right in Berlin, Paris and London, a complete inversion of what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years.
Very strange times. Yeah.
Hopefully not, of course. By the way, that's why you support Novara Media. But if you look at the polling right now, and if you're trying to make bets about the future, that's where we seem to be going, certainly in Germany and France.
With less than 2 weeks to go until the by-election of the century, Question Time held a special episode involving some of the candidates vying to be the new MP for Makerfield. And the central question was, how can politicians restore trust in politics? Perhaps a fitting question because, as everyone knows, there's a lot more at stake for one of those candidates, with Labour's Andy Burnham thought to be eyeing up the leadership of the party if he wins. I say thought to, everybody knows he is. That potential path to Prime Minister came up on the show straight away.
I mean, you have to be hidden under a rock to think maybe you aren't going to go for the leadership against Keir. What changes are you going to make that Labour Party great again?
I mean, I'm making no assumptions about this election. I'm not, because you all know it's tight. You know that. Because you speak to people in your communities.
No, this is why you're running, Andy. Let's be clear about that.
Answer the question. I mean, it's an important question. It's not a given, and I don't see it as such. I'm fighting hard because, to me, it is about trying to rebuild politics and make it work for people here. And when I was in the cabinet, I had influence, and I used it for people here. I got the Lee Sports Village built. We got Bickershaw Marina. I got a young girl who'd been abducted and taken to Libya. I got her back with her mum in Hindley Green. I have always used my political influence for people here. Hillsborough was another example. I've never abandoned this place at all. On Sunday, it's the 25th anniversary of me being an elected Greater Manchester representative, but I know I can't do everything within the system as it currently is. All right. So all I can say to you is, I would take the fight to change politics and change this country as high as I could so that it works for here. All right. And it doesn't work for here right now.
Now, that answer really didn't satisfy some in the audience.
So I watch the programme all the time, every week. And
oh, good. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you very much.
And I just find that politicians can never answer a question straight. You ask them a question, you never get an answer. And it is so disappointing when Fiona asks you, will you stand, to challenge Keir Starmer, that you cannot say yes, that you will. We all know that you will, so why can't you just say it?
I'm not somebody who gets ahead of myself. I can't do anything unless I'm lucky enough to get the support of people here. But if I get your support, I would seek to represent you at the highest possible level and give this constituency maximum power and influence. I think Wes Streeting seems to have launched a leadership contest. So if that is running, I would seek to join it. But I'd have to persuade members of the Parliamentary Labour Party to do the same.
Aaron, what do you think of that? The answer to those questions on whether he's going to run. I mean, like everybody knows he is. That woman's quite right. Why not just say it?
Yeah, well, it's all gridded out, wasn't it? I think so. You know, we'll find out these particular messages and headlines when we get them. Very professional press operation, it must be said. I thought he was really impressive. I thought he was really good. And you know, something we don't talk about nearly enough in politics is age. Burnham's 56. He feels like a very different politician to when he was in his early 40s. Doesn't mean he's changed his views on anything. I think he probably has, but that's by the by. The style is much more calm, much more relaxed. And I actually saw this a lot with Starmer. You know, I don't really praise Starmer very much because I don't think he should be praised. But one thing that was really noticeably different between Starmer and even Sunak, Truss, maybe even Boris Johnson, was he had that extra 10 years and he was just a lot calmer. And I think, you know, I love young people in politics. But sometimes it's useful to just have somebody who's, you know, I mean, the problem with Starmer is he's so calm, he's kind of dying. You know, he's doing a terrible job. You need some oomph and some, you know, up and at him. He doesn't have it. But I think with Burnham, he's really in the sweet spot of still being a young man. I think most people can relate to him. I think young and old can kind of relate to him. He's 56. He's still got lots of energy, but he's much more calm. And I think he's much more assured in himself in terms of media performance. I don't think people think, oh, well, therefore I support Andy Burnham. I think on some things he's moved in a good direction since being in the Blair cabinet, and on other things it's unclear where he's moved. But in terms of these kinds of situations, BBC Question Time, he's a really formidable person. It's very different to the politician we saw 11 years ago in the Labour leadership contest in 2015. He was very anxious. I think partly because he didn't really know what his place in the Labour Party was. He'd come out of the Blairite faction. He's kind of a creature of the soft left, but you had this huge membership on the radical left all of a sudden who weren't happy with his positions on welfare. I think post-Starmer, he's got quite an easy sell. I'm just going to be, as Prime Minister, what this guy promised to be, but didn't do it. That's quite easy, right? And that won a big mandate, both with the Labour Party, but also with the electorate. So that's quite easy for him to step into. And I think that means he can make the most of his kind of personality and his ease as a politician who's been doing this for more than 25 years now.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something, he's very, this kind of like interesting combination of like relaxed and self-assured. So it doesn't look like, you know, pompous or anything like that in the way that Keir Starmer can look. And he doesn't look sort of like twitchy, you know, rabbit in the headlights like Keir Starmer can also look. He has like this feeling of like statesman-like, but also relatability. I guess what in America they call like the beer factor, right? You want to have a drink with him.
Yeah.
But I guess also to his advantage, he has the fact that a lot of people just feel like anyone but Starmer right now. So, you know, he could literally, you know, have that attitude, not really get too into the weeds about what he wants to do politically or policy-wise, has the kind of glow of Manchester behind him. And people are going to like him because, you know, nobody wants Starmer. They know the Labour Party's not going anywhere for a couple of years, and they just don't see any talent in government, right? He's sort of, everything is laid out for him, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And this is politics, isn't it? You know, he tried to be the leader twice, didn't work in 2010 and 2015, didn't work. He leaves the party. I presume he leaves the parliamentary party, I should say. I presume he never thought this was going to happen. But now, like you say, we're in this sort of Goldilocks set of circumstances, which seems tailor-made for him. He's a politician who's part of the establishment, but not of it. You know, he's from the Northwest. He's represented the Northwest. And like you say, he has that beer factor. I think what's interesting is, for him, you know, we've heard, for instance, today some stuff about business rates. You know, he was sympathetic with businesses that didn't want also increases to the employer national insurance contributions. These are things that people on the centre-right are going to really like to hear. They see that he's quite affable. They see he's got a track record of doing stuff. You know, they might give Labour a second look. They're not really looking at reform because they're just too wacky and wild for them. It's a really, really interesting mix. You know, the thing for him is he's going to have to land quickly. And there's talk today of, you know, him keeping Rachel Reeves as Chancellor. On the one hand, that makes sense. You've got the markets. They need to stay calm. You don't want to change anything too quickly. But equally, you do want to offer a break with what has been a terrible 2 years for the country and for the Labour government. So choices like that are going to be the ones that I think that really define him quickly. But I think all the way through now, if he wins this by-election, big if, but if he wins this by-election, I can see him really gaining profile and his political brand becoming stronger and stronger. The real challenge will be as soon as he gets into number 10.
Yeah, that's a whole different story, right?
Yeah.
That's a massive different story. And also, I mean, I guess he doesn't have an electoral challenge for a few years, though. Once he gets in, he does have some time to work it out. It's just a question of whether he can get the support of the backbenchers to sort of stick with him if there are a few hiccups at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And he's got to get that cabinet right straight away. I don't know about keeping Rachel Reeves. I feel like she's sort of so intimately bound with Keir Starmer that I'm not sure people will really believe it's a fresh start if she's still there.
I agree. Make her business secretary or something.
Give her a job, but just not that one. I thought I saw somewhere that well, this is briefing. It could be from Ops. I don't know, but that he'd offered it to Shabana Mahmood,
which would be crazy, I think.
But did you read that as well? Or
I did. I think Ed Miliband seems the most sensible option.
Yeah, totally.
And you'd keep Shabana Mahmood. Again, this is not my personal view, but I think that would be sensible. You keep Shabana Mahmood there. I would also say that, it's hard for Labour to do any worse than they've done in the last 2 local elections, right? It's hard for Labour to have a worse by-election result than what they've got in Gorton and Denton. So, he's also, we talked about the Goldilocks kind of circumstances. Another one is how badly Labour have been doing. Even if Labour go into local elections next May, his first set of local elections as PM, and they lose 200 councillors, people say, wow, that's so good compared to Starmer.
1,200 or whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, I said this about Corbyn after 2015, and, I was proven right in 2017. People were saying how terrible he is. And I said, but hold on a second. Ed Miliband got 30% in 2015. Corbyn just needs to get 32%. And people are saying, okay, fine, he gets another go. That's all he had to do.
Yeah.
And 30% was actually quite low. It was quite bad. 28% with Gordon Brown made it look good, but 38% historically is quite bad in a 2-party system. And of course, the Lib Dems were collapsing. So I think it's really all set up for Burnham. And if he screws up, it's on him. It's one of those where it's on him. Some politicians come in, they have really tough circumstances thrown at them. You say Boris Johnson with COVID, for instance, as PM. I don't think that's the case for Burnham so far.
Well, let's go on to have a look at Burnham's major competitor, Reform UK's Robert Kenyon. He wanted to talk a little bit more about Burnham's potential career ambitions on the show.
Just go back to Billy's question about restoring trust. I think a big move away from career politicians would certainly help, and having normal people involved in politics. Andy touches on us being the fastest growing economy. Does anybody in Makerfield feel that we've got the fastest growing economy? Or is it all just kept in Manchester? We keep giving our council tax. There's a bigger percentage every year being taken by Manchester. While Manchester thrives, we're struggling to survive in Wigan. We've been left behind. So my point would be, get normal people in politics, people who care about the place, people who live in the place, and people who want to stay here and not use it as a stepping stone for other things.
I think that was quite a smart line, actually, to try and get Andy Burnham on the thing that he's sort of most admired for, which is being Mayor of Manchester, even though, he's not in charge of council tax, but, associating him with actually ripping the people of the constituency off. Now, an archive of Robert Kenyon's old tweets recently turned up, revealing that he'd said some pretty unsavory and sexist things about women, including perhaps joking, perhaps not, endorsing a very explicit post about Carol Vorderman. Those, of course, featured on the show quite heavily.
I'd rather have a career politician than a plumber who's a sexist.
So, Rob, I want to give you a chance to answer that. I want to give you a measure. So just for those of you may not all be aware of things that Rob has said in the past, you described yourself as sexist.
Allegedly.
You're denying that was a tweet by you?
Some of the things, not...
Okay, you described yourself as a sexist. You have made offensive comments about women. You've admitted that. You've also said that abortion is the cowardly act of women murdering defenseless baby, and that women do it so they can shag anyone they want. That's your phrase, not mine. As I say, I'm raising it because lots of people in the audience raise it, and I want to give you a chance to answer.
That's okay. I'll address those questions. So I won't accept that label. I mean, a lot of the things have been said 15 years ago. I hold my hands up. I've made mistakes. And said
the one about abortion was just 2 to 3 years ago.
I'm just addressing the first point where she said, where I was given a label that I won't accept. I was brought up by a single parent, and my grandma, who was a widow, and an older sister. So I was brought up by women. I've got nothing but respect for women. So I think something that's said 15 years ago, dragged up from an old rugby forum, it's completely taken out of context. And like I say, I've made mistakes. I've said things years ago that I wouldn't say now, and I definitely don't believe that on that point. You know, so I hope that addresses that issue, and it's like I say, I've got nothing but respect for women.
There was actually quite a lot of the women in that Makerfield audience looking pretty unimpressed, I have to say. And it got worse for Kenyon when Sarah Wakefield for the Green Party chimed in.
I actually spoke to Carol Vorderman this morning. She called me because she is really distressed that you have failed to apologise for any of these comments. So you said
about her specifically?
Her specifically. And she is watching at home tonight. And I wonder if you can look down that camera and say to Carol, you know what, I'm sorry. Can you do that?
Do you know what? You know, people have probably seen what's been said, but I never actually said anything to Carol. I commented on a comment. Okay. Don't get me wrong, it was a disgusting comment that somebody else had written, but I commented on the comment.
With approval?
Okay.
Pardon?
With approval?
No, it was a crass joke, and it's not something I'd say now.
Can I just say,
every
woman in this room and at home has been subject to shaming, whether in person or online.
And that's disgusting. It's horrible, yeah.
I think you're just proving my point. Can you believe this? Honestly, we have all been subjected to it. And the fact that a man like you cannot sit and do a simple apology, I think is disgraceful. But on top of that, reforms policies on women are shocking. Right. Reform on day one wants to repeal the Equality Act. That is your party policy. I can't believe, as a mum of a young daughter, I'm having to sit here in 2026 and make the case for me and my daughter to have the right for equal pay. This is what the Reform Party stand for. They are a party that has a problem with women and they need to sort it out.
Well, Kenyon wouldn't apologise. He did have an answer on the policy front.
So we will replace the Equalities Act with the Workplace Fairness Act, and all those women's protections will carry over into the new Act. Hard-fought women's protections will suffer or be scrapped. They'll all go over, especially with maternity and pregnancy.
Aaron, does Reform have a women problem? It certainly looked like it in that audience.
Yes, 100%. And they have a women's problem in a number of ways. One is that women are less likely to vote for them. And if they want to get over the line in terms of a majority, they're going to need more women to vote for them. This is one of the reasons why, not that they don't believe in it as an issue, but it's one of the reasons why they talk about sexual assault, why they talk about grooming gangs, etc. These are huge issues. They have been abhorrent historically. They've been very poorly dealt with by successive governments. But I think one of the reasons politically why they focus on it, one of the reasons, they believe in all of it. But I think it is an important way of activating voters they previously couldn't access, which is mums, which is middle-aged women, right? I think any sensible person out there is going to hear these kinds of stories and think this is revolting. I want something done about it. And the truth is that the two major parties actually didn't do very much about it. So there's a political logic at work. Again, to repeat, I don't think they're doing it just because of that. But I think, it activates a certain demographic they need to get that majority. And some polls which put them over the edge, which put them at 400 plus seats, that's possible if they get more women voters. Right now, it's older voters and it's older men is their bedrock vote. If they can get more women voters, they don't even need young people. That's the real one for them. And that's also, by the way, why they got Sarah Pochinen in Runcorn, their first female MP, who won that by-election there last year, even though I don't think she's a particularly good candidate. Robert Kenyon there, though, showed a few contradictions to them, some challenges. So the reason why he's been selected in that constituency, of course, is because they learned the hard way with Matt Goodwin, parachuting in a celebrity activist, an ideologue. And I think we need more ideologues in politics. I like ideology. But Matt Goodwin is an ideologue. He's a right-wing ideologue. But he wasn't from the area. He wasn't from South Manchester. He's, of course, from south of England. He looks like a home county.
Yeah, he tried very hard to pretend he had some connection, right? But
just open your gob and people know, right? He looks and sounds like a home county's estate agent with his Rolex and his nice suits. And that didn't work. And I think, what Reform then subsequently learnt from that was, well, okay, we need a local candidate next time. By the way, look how well the Greens did with Hannah Spencer. We need our Hannah Spencer. Turns out it's not that easy. Hannah Spencer is an extraordinary person, very effective political candidate, great orator, has a great gift for human connection. He doesn't. He's clearly an intelligent guy. He would make a good councillor for reform or a good Tory councillor. I'm not suggesting he should be nowhere near public service. Again, I don't agree with him or those comments, but from that side of politics, you can see why he would be a councillor or even a council group leader or a council leader. But in terms of a politician with a national profile, I mean, he's clearly not good enough. He's clearly not Andy Burnham. He's clearly not Hannah Spencer. And so that's the challenge there for reform is we want the everyman, we want the local candidate. Okay, but you also do need that extra bit. He also said something against Burnham, which was, I won't be a career politician, I'm from here. Burnham lives there. His kids or his 3 children all went to school inside the constituency. So the fact he's using attack lines for a candidate who isn't standing for Labour, who would have been a candidate that they otherwise probably would have picked, right? Like they did in Gorton and Denton, a suboptimal candidate. He's using those attack lines, which I think shows how much trouble they're in. Burnham ultimately is proving much more effective, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit in a minute. Burnham is proving much more effective in hegemonizing the left vote, squeezing the Lib Dems, squeezing the Greens, than he is in squeezing Restore. That's the big problem for reform in the constituency. So Robert Kenyon, I have no personal animus against him. I think he dealt with all that terribly. All he has to do is just say, I'm really sorry, it's appalling. I'm happy to, once I'm an MP, once I'm in the Houses of Parliament representing the great people of this constituency, I'm really happy to meet Carol Vorderman. I'll apologise to her face to face, very happy to do it. All he has to say, for some reason he can't do it. If you can't do that, if you can't think in those terms, if you can't respond on your feet in a situation like that, sadly, you're not gonna be a national political figure, nor do you deserve to be.
Yeah, I think he also just handed Sarah Wakefield moments, right? When he's like speaking over her and she's like, look, he's doing it again. Look at what you've got. On the Burnham hoovering up the left vote, I mean, we're going to come to it in a minute, but I think it's worth pointing out that, like, on my understanding, the Greens are actually just doing very, very little there to try and challenge him. But I think they, obviously taking every opportunity to field or to show a possible future candidate somewhere else, because I think Sarah Wakefield's performance on Question Time was very solid for someone I haven't seen much of before.
She's great. I mean, also, she might run in local elections, and they might build an operation out from there. I mean, it's important to say that in Manchester, I don't know how many councillors they had, but they did have councillors. When they won in Gorton and Denton, this is not somewhere they would be targeting. That Gorton Denton is very much Manchester.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Denton less so, but the Gorton, Levenshulme is definitely somewhere that you walk around. It should be green. There's parts of my constituency, Portsmouth South, I walk around, this should be green. You walk around Portsmouth North, this should be reform. This constituency, I'm going up there later today, is certainly not, this should be green. So I think you're right. She's playing a clever game, both personally for the long term, but also I think the Greens are playing a clever game. I think withdrawing and not standing a candidate would have been a really stupid, ill-advised thing to do. By having a candidate and not really campaigning hard, you are, on the one hand, helping to influence the broader political conditions, the tone and tenor of the conversation. But on the other, you're not really undermining Burnham's vote. You're most certainly hurting Kenyon's. And you're making him look like a minority figure. When you've got her and Burnham on the same platform, both attacking him from the left, that helps Burnham. Yeah. So I think it's a smart move. It's a smart move by the Greens to have her there.
Also, in such a high-profile by-election, it gives the Greens a chance to air their policies to the nation. Yeah. Ahead of other elections, a general election. All right. Now, you said you're going up to the constituency tonight. What are you expecting to find there? Who are you going to talk to? What do you want to find out?
I never have preconceptions before we do these things. We're going to a site which was just I think it's one of the largest fly tipping sites in Northwest history.
Exciting.
My kind of gig, right? Like thousands and thousands of kilos of tens of thousands of kilos of crap just dumped. So that'd be fun. And the authorities didn't really do much about it for a long time. I want to talk to Reform and Tory voters who like Burnham, because the last time I was in Gorton and Denton, I met lots of those people. I remember speaking to some people, a couple, they had voted Brexit, they'd voted for Boris, they never vote Labour, except in mayoral elections when they vote for Andy Burnham. And I think the Reform sort of people you see on X, the centre-right pundits you see on TV, I don't think they're aware of this. I think any other candidate for Labour in this constituency would have been smashed. The fact that it's even close is a real testament to Burnham's personal political brand in the area.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. That's going to be a Bastani's Britain.
Be a Bastani's Britain.
Great.
Should be out next week.
Excellent.
If you're in Denton, if you're in Makerfield or Wigan, get in touch.
Do it.
My DMs are open on X.
All right, let's move on with this story. Reform UK have been in the news this week for another reason. On Tuesday, police body cam footage of the dying moments of 18-year-old Southampton student Henry Novak was released. In it, we saw the police handcuff the stabbed teenager, ignore his protest that he couldn't breathe, and when he tried to tell them he'd been stabbed, one replied with, "I don't think you have, mate." And while his actual murderer, Vikram Digwa, stood by, telling the police he'd been racially assaulted and pointing to non-existent bruises on his eye. It was a truly, disgusting scene, burned into all of our minds. And it probably wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the entire country was gripped by anger, despair, and disgust. But Reform leader Nigel Farage went further, telling his supporters, quote, "I suggest the rest of us respond to this with pure, cold rage." Later that night, there were scenes of violence on the streets of Southampton, with fires set and wheelie bins, bricks, bottles, and other projectiles thrown at police, all while members of extreme right-wing parties and groups participated. 11 police officers, all, as far as we know, uninvolved in the shocking negligence around Henry Novak's care, were injured. Nigel Farage was repeatedly asked to condemn that violence in Parliament on Wednesday. He wouldn't. On Question Time, Robert Kenyon, his candidate in Makerfield, was given a chance instead.
I'd just like to ask, in terms of Nigel Farage not condemning the violence that went on the other evening, would Rob care to condemn it this evening? Okay,
Let me just briefly allow you to do that if you want to. You're being asked, do you want to condemn the violence that took place in Southampton?
100% condemn the violence. Violence is not the answer to this. What we need to do is make sure we do it politically, and we Reform's policies to get 30,000 extra police officers on the street, and ban knives, regardless of religious background, that we ban knives completely.
So there's the Reform candidate in Makerfield just, straight away condemning the violence in Southampton, something that I think Farage has now done. He only did it quite late yesterday in an exclusive with GB News, but he held off for good 48 hours or so. What do you make of it what is the politics here? Like, Farage won't do it, or won't do it for a long time. Kenyon does it straight away. Does he understand the Makerfield constituency better than, does he understand it in a way that means that that's like really necessary there? Although perhaps Farage is talking to people for whom if they really don't want to hear an apology or a condemnation about the violence.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I never really understand these things because, of course, there's sometimes violence by people on the left, and people are calling on you to condemn it. And, it's possible to explain something without excusing it, isn't it? You just say, look, something awful has happened. Some people have chosen to do this. I don't think that's ideal or it's going to work.
Oh, hang on. He did say you should respond with pure cold rage.
No, but that's my point. You don't need to do that. I'm saying with regards to Kenyon.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
It's a very easy thing to do. Just say, look, here's an explanation why people be so angry. I don't think that's right. But you can understand why they do it. That's sort of Michael Walker take, isn't it? It's a quite easy thing to do. And so you're right. It's all the more puzzling that Farage wouldn't do it for so long. And I think there's only one reason why that's the case. 2 words: Rupert Lowe.
Yeah, we're coming to that.
And it's about Restore. We're going to talk about all of this, but Restore is the potential, jack in the box variable for this by-election. And that's, I think, the entire explanation starts and ends there as to why Farage wouldn't apologise or condemn, apologise for comments or condemn what's happened, because he's a canny enough political operator to know that you can do that, show a bit of leg to your supporters, and then wind things back 48 hours later. He hasn't done that here because I don't think he thinks he can.
It's interesting. We've spoken so many times on this show about what Reform's electoral strategy is. And one thing that's been really clear is that if they want to be the party of government, they actually have to appeal quite broadly. They have to get a lot of Tories. And I just wonder if maybe Farage just acted very quickly under the pressure of Restore in the wake of the Novak body tape, because you really don't appeal to Tories by encouraging people to go and attack the police. You really don't appeal to Tories by looking like you're telling people to go out and do street violence. That's not what Tories are into, right? Tories like the police and they like safe streets. So, was it a strategic wobble? Is it really just rattled by Restore to such an extent that he's actually not thinking very clearly?
Yeah, I think 100%. And, in a way he's lucky because what happened in Southampton was bad, but it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
And if somebody dies, if a police officer is, critically injured, if a female police officer gets hit on the head with a brick and she's in a coma, Farage is screwed.
Yeah, finished.
Right? And I don't think they really have, thought it through. And I think it's something I've thought about a lot with reform politicians is that they're so online, particularly on X, they are so eager to insert themselves within, real-time politics, often to their benefit. But I think sometimes that can really be to their detriment. You saw that, I think, for the first time, really, with Matt Goodwin in the by-election in Galston and Denton. He was constantly trying to insert himself in real-time debates online. And, Hannah Spencer was just knocking on doors and talking to people about potholes in local businesses and business rates and litter,
Yeah.
So it's good in terms of getting, national polling and whatnot, but in a by-election, it's not the best bet. And I think Kenyon probably knows that too. But it's the modus operandi which has got Farage where he is. Is that enough then to A, get you into government, but also B, to govern? Kemi Badenoch had a great line, actually. We don't need rage, we need courage. It's true. You need courage and you need to offer substantive responses, political and policy responses. And I don't see them coming from reform. I just don't see them coming from reform on issue after issue. Maybe migration, you can say. I don't agree with any of it, of course, but there's a coherent policy platform. But on the police, I don't know what are they going to abolish? Are they going to abolish, county forces and go to a national force? Are they going to completely redo training? There's an interesting analogue here, by the way, and I don't like reductio ad Hitlerums, but the National Socialists, I can't remember what part of Germany it was in, but they get in the very early 30s, they join a coalition governing a part of Germany, and this is crazy, and they get a position, some, senior Third Reich scholar will be in the comments, and do you know what job they want? They want two jobs. One is they want to rewrite the school curriculum. Surprise! And another one is to do with policing.
Right, okay.
And particularly on the school curriculum one, it just collapses. It's appalling, which is one of the reasons why, years later with Hindenburg and the Liberals, they say, oh, well, you can let the Nazis run things because they screw it all up anyway, which was true. But, I do feel like on this stuff, you can't govern by, excuse my French, you can't govern by fucking viral tweets.
No.
And hashtags and clout and, getting eyeballs onto GB News. It's really good in opposition. It's really good for a social movement. I would like the left to do that sometimes on some things. You can't govern like that. You can't govern like that.
You also can't govern on disunity, right? Which is that what seems to have been encouraged there, and especially like again the other political moment is as I said in the piece, everybody felt the same way about that body cam. It's not like there were some people who were like, oh well, who cares? Everybody who saw it felt disgusted, angry, so on, and yet Farage didn't seem to be able to grab the kind of unity that exists. The compassion people felt for that poor teenage boy and the anger they felt with the police.
Yeah,
he had to find the wedge, and maybe that's just the habit. He's always got to find the wedge.
It's the muscle memory, right?
So the muscle memory,
right.
yeah.
He could have got that issue and say, you know what, we can get 70% of the public on this, 75%. There are big problems with the police, whether you're on the right or the left, town or country. There's a consensus emerging there, but he can't do it because the muscle memory is polarization, wedge issues, exactly. 52-48. But hold on, you've got 80% of people with you. You don't need to do that, Nigel.
Maybe there'll be a contender to replace him pretty soon, actually, because that is actually really dumb political thinking, right? That's a really not to be able to control your own instincts when the situation has changed. I think is the sign of a poor politician. They become predictable and then they lose.
Well, he's an outstanding campaigner, but also to their credit, let's say, they're trying to do what should be politically impossible, to go from no MPs to government in under a decade, to go from 4 MPs in 2024 to a majority by 2029. That should be impossible, and that would take a political genius. But I think, if you're going to do that, then like you say, you need the Tory voters. Sometimes do need to be a coalition builder and actually bring people in. There's a part of me that's really surprised that Reform haven't try to get in more left-coded people and arguments. They did it a little bit with steel nationalisation, but since then, they've gone generic, Tory, and now they've really doubled down on the radical right stuff with Rupert Lowe.
Yeah.
Which, you can still be a really big party in Parliament. I don't doubt that for a second, but it does make achieving that majority at Westminster at the next general election that bit harder.
Let's go on to the polls because they are something else to look at. So on that Question Time panel, we had Labour, Reform, the Greens, the Tories, and the Lib Dems, which means there was one very noticeable absence, made even more noticeable when you look at current, very, very strange or unusual polling happening in Makerfield. Polling by Survation shows that Andy Burnham enjoys a 10-point lead in the constituency, with almost half of those polled behind him. Next comes Reform's Robert Kenyon on 39%, and this is where it gets really interesting. The next most popular candidate, and then the most popular in third place by quite a long way, with 8% of the vote, is Rebecca Shepherd from Restore, and she did not have a seat at the Question Time panel. So as you saw there, the Lib Dems, the Tories, the Greens, all with a fraction of the vote amongst them were there. Rebecca Shepherd, who is in third place, and actually taking away winning votes from Reform, the votes needed to close that gap with Burnham wasn't there. Rupert Lowe, Bristol's founder, is pretty furious about it. He's penned an open letter to the BBC demanding to know why the party was snubbed. In reply, a BBC spokesperson said this: "There are 14 candidates in the Makerfield by-election on the 18th of June. Question Time has invited 5 parties to take part in our debate in the constituency, based, as is always the case, on their past and current electoral support. The programme will ensure there are appropriate references to all the candidates standing." The BBC, Aaron, doesn't seem to know what's going on, because if you're just going to base things on previous electoral support, you're just not going to be keeping up with the politics as it's changing in this country so quickly.
No.
So what do you think is going on here in Makerfield with Restore? And why did the BBC snub them?
Well, if Restore keep their deposit, which is to say if they get more than 5%, I think this is really bad of the BBC. I suspect that Restore will come third. That could be 5%, that could be 10%. Famous last words, they get 3%. But I do think in almost all likelihood they will come third, because that Lib Dem and that Green vote is being so squeezed, and the Tories, if you look at some of the polling, 2%. It's moving about a bit, but tiny polling for the Tories in the constituency. They made the same mistake with Gorton Denton. I mean, that's crazy, because you could, at least in their defence here, they'll say, well, look, Restore only have 1 MP. The Greens had 4 MPs from the last general election, and on the night of the vote in Gorton and Denton, I'll never forget it, on the night of the vote, there wasn't a Green candidate, a Green spokesperson rather, on BBC Question Time, nor the week before. And I just said, this is crazy. She might not win, she might come second, but she's making the political weather along with Reform, and they have 4 MPs. What on earth are you doing? And also, by the way, it's a huge story. Even if the Greens come second, they've finished ahead of Labour, who are lagging nationally. There was a huge public interest in platforming the Greens in Gorton Denton. They didn't do it. I don't think this is quite that bad, but it's not like Restore have no MPs. Rupert Lowe is an MP. They did win councillors. I think they won 19, 20 councillors in the local elections. They are a political party. It's not some joke party like UKIP now with Nick Tenconi. They're a real party. And, if they come third, I think it's awful. And this is the BBC, I'm afraid. They just pursue the path of least resistance, uninteresting content. They don't challenge themselves or their audiences. And like you say, you can do that when it's Labour, Tory, Tory, Labour, Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, Labour, Tory. But British politics is changing so fast now. Look at someone like Wales. Plaid Cymru come first, Reform come second. You have to start thinking differently in terms of how you cover these stories.
Yeah, totally. All right, Aaron, I'm going to let you go. You've got to get a train to Makerfield, to Wigan. Hope you have a really great time. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. And also, look, these are great shirts. Aren't they great shirts? Some wise guy, Tom Clements, will say on the Novara Slack channel, I think we should do football shirts. I think, I like the idea, but this could be terribly executed. They're gorgeous. Well done, Tom. I love the way it just happens. Like one day you see a suggestion, and the next day you've got some actually quite swish kit. Yeah. Yeah, great. Also, it's got our names on the back, although I'm borrowing one for tonight because I left mine at home. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great time in Makerfield. Do come back on Monday for another live show. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.